Fars province, Iran, 60 kilometers northeast of Shiraz. On a vast plain cradled by the Zagros Mountains, Persepolis stands. In 518 BC, Emperor Darius the Great of the Persian Empire ordered the construction of a palace here. He wanted to create the greatest city in the world. This place, called Parsa in Persian, was the heart of the empire. Construction took 50 years. Craftsmen gathered from across the empire. Stonemasons from Egypt, tile artisans from Babylon, sculptors from Greece. They combined their skills to create the most magnificent palace in human history. The palace's scale was astonishing. The area covered 130,000 square meters. 72 columns, each 20 meters high, soared upward. Each column wasn't a single piece. They were precisely stacked stone segments. Modern scholars still marvel at how they achieved such accuracy. The walls were covered in gold leaf. Tiles glazed in turquoise and cobalt blue sparkled in the sunlight. From a distance, the entire palace appeared to glow. Particularly famous was the Apadana Palace, the king's audience hall. Here, reliefs depicted processions of envoys from around the world. Media, Elam, Bactria, India, Egypt. Representatives of 23 nations bearing tribute. The gifts they brought were diverse. Gold and silver treasures, spices, textiles, weapons, even animals like lions and elephants. These reliefs were evidence of how vast the Persian Empire had become. Persepolis wasn't merely a palace. It housed a vast library, treasure vaults, and administrative buildings. The library particularly contained the concentrated knowledge of 200 years of Persian Empire history, clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script, Zoroastrian scriptures written on parchment, knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and agriculture. Millennia of accumulated wisdom from Mesopotamia and Persia gathered here. Each spring brought the Nowruz festival, Persia's New Year celebration. Nobles and governors from across the empire congregated at Persepolis. They pledged loyalty to the emperor and enjoyed the festivities. For 200 years, Persepolis symbolized the Persian Empire, the heart of a vast empire, stretching from India to Egypt, from Central Asia to Greece. But in 330 BC, everything changed. A young conqueror was approaching from the west. In 334 BC, Alexander inherited his father's dream and marched eastward. His goal was conquering the Persian Empire. He achieved his first victory at the Granicus River. At the Battle of Issus, he defeated Persian Emperor Darius III. At the Battle of Gaugamela, he crushed Persia's main forces. After 4 years of warfare, Alexander finally arrived at Persepolis. It was spring 330 BC. According to ancient historian Diodorus, Persepolis didn't resist. Darius III had already fled eastward, and the city lacked the strength to defend itself. Imagine the moment Alexander entered the palace. He had conquered countless cities, but Persepolis was different. This was the most magnificent place he had ever seen. Columns decorated with gold, walls filled with reliefs, crystal chandeliers hanging from ceilings, Persian carpets covering floors. He had grown up in Macedonia's modest palace. He couldn't have imagined such splendor. When guided to the treasury, he was even more astonished. Ancient historian Plutarch recorded, there were 120,000 talents of gold and silver. 120,000 talents equals billions of dollars in today's value. Gold ingots, silver bars, jewels, pearls, ivory. 200 years of accumulated imperial wealth resided here. Alexander needed 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to transport it. The quantity was that enormous. During the first few months, Alexander seemed to have no intention of destroying Persepolis. He organized the treasures and examined the palace. He even accepted Persian nobles into his army. He saw himself as Persia's new emperor, not a conqueror but a successor. He began wearing Persian attire and following Persian customs. His Macedonian generals disapproved. "We are conquerors. Why do we wear the defeated's clothes?" They expressed their discontent. Alexander was torn. On one hand, he wanted revenge for Greece and Macedonia. He remembered how 150 years earlier Persian Emperor Xerxes had burned Athens. But on the other hand, he was fascinated by Persian civilization. He wanted to inherit this great empire. His dream was uniting East and West. Several months passed this way. Persepolis remained intact. Alexander was preparing to leave soon to pursue Darius. Then one night, everything changed. Late spring night, 330 BC, Alexander held a grand banquet at Xerxes' palace. It was a celebration of the Gaugamela victory. Ancient historian Plutarch recorded that night's events in detail. Let's follow his account. Macedonian generals gathered in the banquet hall. Wine flowed endlessly, music played. It was a Greek-style symposium, a gathering to drink, discuss, and enjoy. That night there was a special guest. Plutarch recorded her only as a woman from Athens. Another historian, Diodorus, specified her name, Thais. She was accompanying one of the generals, an educated, intelligent woman skilled in speech. That night she dominated the banquet atmosphere. As the night deepened, more wine flowed. Alexander became quite intoxicated. He usually didn't enjoy drinking, but that night was an exception. Right then she stood up. Plutarch's record follows. She said, "Alexander, tonight I shall propose the most glorious act in Asia, to set fire to Xerxes' palace together with you." Why did she make such a proposal? She was from Athens. She remembered when 150 years earlier, Persian Emperor Xerxes invaded Athens. The Acropolis burned. Temples were destroyed. "It's time for revenge," she said. "Let us return to his palace what Xerxes did to our ancestors." Drunken soldiers cheered. Yes, revenge! They were Greeks too. The Persian invasion was suffering their ancestors had endured. How did Alexander respond? Historical records differ slightly, but there's a commonality. He was drunk and swept up in the atmosphere. Diodorus recorded, "The king grew excited at the proposal, and everyone rose drinking and making noise. They grabbed torches. According to Plutarch, she threw the first flame. She was the first after the king to hurl her torch into the palace. Alexander threw his torch too. Generals followed. Soldiers joined in. Instantly, flames erupted throughout the palace. Xerxes' palace was constructed with wooden ceilings and cedar columns. Wall textile decorations, carpets, curtains, everything burned easily. The flames spread rapidly, from one building to the next. The entire palace complex was engulfed in fire. 200 years of accumulated treasures, artworks, documents, all consumed by flames. Ancient historian Arrian recorded, Persepolis was more thoroughly destroyed than any Greek city. That night, the library burned too. Thousands of clay tablet documents, Zoroastrian scriptures written on parchment. 2,000 years of Persian knowledge vanished in an instant. By dawn, the flames were contained. When the smoke cleared and sunlight shone, they finally realized what they had done. The next morning, Alexander awoke from his drunkenness, and he saw what had happened. Persepolis had become ruins. Of the Apadana palace's 72 columns, half had collapsed. Xerxes' palace was completely destroyed. The elaborate reliefs carved into walls were blackened. The greatest loss was the library. 200 years of collected Persian Empire knowledge had vanished. Babylonian astronomical records, Egyptian medical knowledge, Indian mathematical theories, all burned. Zoroastrian priests relate the original Avesta scriptures were in Persepolis. But that night, they all burned. The Avesta that remains today was reconstructed much later from oral tradition. Ancient historian Curtius Rufus recorded Alexander's reaction. The king greatly regretted it and immediately ordered the fire extinguished. But it was already too late. Plutarch's record is more specific. Later it said Alexander regretted this deed. Why did he regret it? First, he saw himself as Persia's successor. Not a conqueror, but a new emperor. Yet he had destroyed the empire's symbol. This undermined his own legitimacy. Second, he loved civilization and knowledge. As Aristotle's student, he understood learning's value. Yet he had burned the most precious library in human history. Third, he had lost his judgment to alcohol. That was probably his greatest regret. A great conqueror had committed an irreversible mistake because of drink. Historian Arrian assessed, it was the most wrong action in Alexander's entire life. So how did history record this event? Interestingly, two narratives exist. One is planned revenge, the story that Alexander deliberately set the fire to avenge Persia. This narrative makes him a Greek hero. The other is drunken mistake, the story that he lost judgment while intoxicated. This seems closer to what actually happened. Both Plutarch and Diodorus recorded the drinking party story, and both wrote that Alexander later regretted it. If it was planned revenge, why would he regret it? Revenge brings satisfaction, not regret. Arrian proposed another theory. Some say Alexander set the fire after careful thought, but I believe this happened while drunk. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Persepolis was destroyed, 2,000 years of knowledge vanished. Alexander never returned to Persepolis afterward. He continued marching east, reaching India. But in his heart, that night's flames must have always remained. In 323 BC, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon at age 32. Whether it was malaria or poisoning is still debated. But one thing is certain. He never restored Persepolis. What burned that night wasn't simply buildings. Humanity's precious knowledge vanished together. What was in Persepolis's library? There are no direct records, but we can estimate from indirect evidence. First, administrative documents. The Persian Empire was vast and required a systematic administrative system. Tax records, military mobilization orders, diplomatic correspondence, all recorded and stored on clay tablets. In the 1930s, the University of Chicago archaeological team excavated Persepolis. They discovered 30,000 burned clay tablet fragments. Most were too damaged to read, but some were decipherable. The contents were astonishing. Administrative records from 509 to 494 BC, wages paid to workers, food rations, construction material inventories. Such detailed records. One tablet read, 20 sheep, 30 jars of wine, sent by order of King Darius for the king's table. Tens of thousands of such records existed. The problem is this represents only a tiny fraction. 30,000 survived the fire. How many burned? Perhaps hundreds of thousands? Second, Zoroastrian scriptures existed. Zoroastrianism, Persia's state religion, possessed vast literature. The scripture called Avesta originally comprised millions of words, it said. But what remains today is less than a quarter. According to Zoroastrian tradition, the original Avesta was written in gold and stored at Persepolis. Alexander burned it, and what remained had to be reconstructed from priests' memories. Third, scientific knowledge existed. The Persian Empire inherited Babylonian and Egyptian science. They had reached high levels in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Babylonian astronomers precisely observed and recorded planetary movements. Their records became the foundation for later Greek astronomy, but most originals were likely at Persepolis and burned. Egyptian medical knowledge also transmitted through Persia. Medical documents written on papyrus were translated into Persian and stored, but these too vanished. Fourth, historical records existed. The Persian Empire's official chronicles, emperors' achievements, war records, all stored in the royal library. The Persian history we know today mostly comes from Greek historians' records. Herodotus, Xenophon, Thucydides. They viewed Persia as enemies, so they inevitably had biased perspectives. Few Persian records themselves remain. Only a few stone inscriptions like the Behistun inscription exist. If Persepolis's library had survived, we could know far more about the Persian Empire. Modern scholars assess this as one of humanity's greatest knowledge losses, along with Alexandria Library's destruction. 2,300 years later, archaeologists still excavate Persepolis, with hopes that more undamaged tablets might remain. Sometimes they make discoveries. Broken fragments, half-readable sentences. By the king's order. The rest is unknown, because it burned. Researchers take those fragments to laboratories. They attempt assembly like puzzles, but most fail. Too many pieces have vanished. Iran's National Museum displays artifacts from Persepolis. Gold bracelets, silver cups, turquoise tile fragments. Things that survived the flames. But the most important things are invisible. Documents, scriptures, scientific records. They became ash and blew away in the wind. Historians still debate what Alexander's intention was, whether it was planned revenge or accidental mistake. But Persepolis doesn't answer. It has kept silence for 2,300 years and will continue to do so. Perhaps that's better. In silence, we can each find our own lessons. Power's transience, civilization's fragility, the eternal consequences of a moment's mistake. Alexander died at 32. The empire he conquered fractured with his death. But the Persepolis he destroyed hasn't been restored, even after 2,300 years. Victory is momentary, but destruction is eternal. Even at this moment, Persepolis stands. Not complete, but not vanished either. Burned, but not completely forgotten. It asks humanity questions. How should we treat the past? Can conquest be justified? Can civilization's destruction be revenge? There are no answers. Persepolis just stands there witnessing in silence. Fars province, Iran. If you go there, you too can hear that silence. The echo of that night 2,300 years ago. The world conquerors regret, and perhaps you'll understand. What history tries to teach us, more important than victory is what you leave behind. More important than conquest is what you preserve. Alexander conquered the world, but he lost Persepolis, and with it, he lost his place as history's perfect hero too. Persepolis is still there. Imperfect but magnificent. Destroyed but immortal. That is history. Not perfect but full of truths we must learn. What happened to Persepolis afterward? After Alexander left, this place was abandoned. What had once been the empire's heart remained as ruins. For hundreds of years, no one paid attention here. Desert sand covered the ruins. Columns toppled. Local people called this place Takht-e-Jamshid, meaning Jamshid's throne. They believed the legendary King Jamshid had built it. In the 17th century, European travelers discovered this place. They couldn't hide their amazement. Could this really have been Persia's capital? But with contemporary technology, proper excavation was impossible. In 1931, University of Chicago, archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld began systematic excavation. After 10 years of work, Persepolis's true form was revealed. In 1979, UNESCO designated Persepolis as a World Cultural Heritage Site. They assessed it as one of the greatest architectural achievements in human history. Today, hundreds of thousands of tourists visit Persepolis annually. They walk through ruins, imagining how magnificent this place was 2,500 years ago, but what they see is only part of the original form. Of Apadana Palace's 72 columns, only 13 stand. Almost nothing remains of Xerxes' palace. Where the library stood is empty ground. Historians ask, what if Alexander hadn't destroyed Persepolis? First, we could know far more about Persian civilization. Their language, religion, science, art, everything would be clearer. Second, East-West cultural exchange could have been richer. Persepolis was the crossroads of East and West. If it had survived to become a center of learning, civilization's development direction might have been different. Third, we could have recovered lost ancient knowledge. Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian medicine, Indian mathematics. All could have been preserved and transmitted through Persia. But history has no hypotheticals. What happened, happened, and we live in those consequences. What is Persepolis's lesson? That mistakes made while drunk create irreparable loss. Even after 2,300 years, even great conquerors leave histories indelible. Scars through momentary misjudgment. Civilization's destruction is instant, but its impact is eternal. Alexander conquered the world for 13 years. But one reason history remembers him is that night he burned Persepolis. Not as glorious victory, but as regret-filled mistake. Iranians say they still feel complex emotions when visiting Persepolis, because proud past and tragic destruction exist simultaneously here. Some call Alexander a conqueror. Some call him a destroyer. The truth is probably somewhere between. He was a great military genius, but also the person who burned 2,000 years of knowledge while drunk. He respected Persian civilization, but also the one who turned its symbol to ash. Fars province, Iran, 60 kilometers northeast of Shiraz. Persepolis still stands there. When sunset comes and last tourists leave, the ruins sink into silence. For 2,300 years, this place has been witnessing something, the remaining 13 columns. They were once 72. If they hadn't burned, 72 would still stand today. Reliefs carved on walls, processions of 23 nations. They walk forever, to bring tribute to the emperor. But that emperor vanished 2,300 years ago. Where the library stood is empty ground. Only wind passes there. A place once holding tens of thousands of documents. Now just a photo spot for tourists. When night comes, stars appear. 2,300 years ago that night, stars were also there. When Alexander and his soldiers threw torches, stars watched in silence. Perhaps only stars know that night's truth. Whether it was really revenge or drunken mistake. Whether Alexander truly regretted it or historians imagined it. But the result is clear. The world's most magnificent palace vanished. Humanity's precious knowledge was lost. Sometimes archaeologists visit. They dig earth, carefully brushing away dust, with hope that more undamaged clay tablets might remain. Sometimes they find them broken fragments, half-readable sentences, by the king's order. What follows is unknown. Because it burned, researchers take those fragments to laboratories. They attempt assembly like puzzles, but most fail. Too many pieces have vanished. Iran's National Museum displays artifacts from Persepolis. Gold bracelets, silver cups, turquoise tile fragments. Things that survived flames, but the most important things are invisible. Documents, scriptures, scientific records. They became ash and blew away in wind. Historians still debate what Alexander's intention was, whether it was planned revenge or spontaneous mistake. But Persepolis doesn't answer. It has kept silence for 2,300 years and will continue. Perhaps that's better. In silence, we can each discover our own lessons. Power's transience, civilization's fragility, the eternal consequences a moment's mistake creates. Alexander died at 32. The empire he conquered fractured with his death. But the Persepolis he destroyed hasn't been restored after 2,300 years. Victory is momentary, but destruction is eternal. Even at this moment, Persepolis stands. Not complete, but not vanished. Burned, but not completely forgotten. It asks humanity questions. How should we treat the past? Can conquest be justified? Can civilization's destruction be revenge? There are no answers. Persepolis just stands there witnessing in silence. Fars province, Iran. If you go there, you too can hear that silence. The echo of that night 2,300 years ago. The world conquerors regret, and perhaps you'll understand. What history tries to teach us, more important than victory is what you leave behind. More important than conquest is what you preserve. Alexander conquered the world, but he lost Persepolis, and with it, he lost his place as history's perfect hero. Persepolis is still there. Imperfect but magnificent. Destroyed but immortal. That is history. Not perfect, but full of truths we must learn.